But anyway, appreciate Mark jumping in and covering Joel. I guess at the time I thought Joel fit a little bit better with where I was, and then I listened to Mark, who did a lot more research, as you can tell, than me. Thought, oh, this really doesn't fit into where we are. So, nice little excursus. I think Micah is going to kind of flow logically out of Amos and Hosea. So, did anybody get a chance to read Micah? Any thoughts, comments? If you want to start turning to Micah, that is where we will be today. Let me start by reading the first verse of Micah, or maybe somebody's there who wants to read it. Just the first verse of Micah, chapter 1.
The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, the vision he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem.
Thank you. So Micah starts, as with many of these prophets, the word of the Lord came to, name of the prophet. We don't get very much about a prophet. We usually say who their father was, what town they are from, and then we get which kings they were prophesying during. What do you notice is different from Amos and Hosea right off the...
He directs what kingdoms it's to.
What's that?
He's directing what kingdoms this prophecies to.
Yes. And what would Samaria and Jerusalem indicate?
That's the northern kingdom?
Yeah, Samaria would be the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem would be the capital of the southern kingdom. It would be, well, Micah's a little unique in that he's a little bit of a transitionary prophet from earlier prophets that look at, well, they were prophesying around the same time, so I don't mean to say earlier, but the two prophets we looked at, they were prophesying directly to the northern kingdom of Israel, Amos and Hosea. Amos is now focusing most of his prophecy to Judah, although he's going to throw in quite a bit at the northern kingdom as well. What's also unique about Micah is he's a prophet from the south. He's prophesying to the south, but this is that time when the northern kingdom was still kind of there. Now, they were slowly deteriorating because of the Assyrians, but they still existed. There's other prophets we'll look at prophesying to the southern kingdom during a time when the northern kingdom was overrun by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom was still holding on. And so what we'll see even in Micah is prophesying towards a time when the Assyrians were going to continue to come through the north, but they weren't going to quite overcome the walls of Jerusalem, which we've talked about previously. Micah's a little bit more optimistic too. You'll notice that there's a few more descriptions of the future renewal. We get a really great passage on the coming Messiah. And so if you're feeling down and, with some of these prophecies, know that Micah is going to be a little bit more uplifting today. So what I'd like to do, Micah is 7 chapters. It kind of moves in the book moves in about 3 movements. There's 7 chapters. What I'm going to really look at is the middle kind of 3, 4, and 5. It's always a struggle to know what to focus on, what not to. I always try to kind of bring out things that are unique. I mean, we could read through chapters 1 to 2, but 1 to 2 kind of repeats a lot of the same things that you probably heard when we studied Amos and Hosea. But let's start in chapter 3. Could I get a volunteer to read chapter 3, verses 1 to 8?
And I said, listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice, you who hate good and love evil, who tear the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones, who eat my people's flesh, strip off their skin and break their bones in pieces, who chop them up like meat for the pan, like flesh for the pot. Then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. At that time he will hide his face from them because of the evil they have done. This is what the Lord says. As for the prophets who lead my people astray, if one feeds them, they proclaim peace. If he does not, they prepare to wage war against him. Therefore night will come over you without visions, and darkness without divination. sun will set for the prophets, and the day will go dark for them. The seers will be ashamed, and the diviners disgraced. They will all cover their faces because there is no answer from God. How far am I going?
End of 8. Do you want to just read
But
it?
as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, to Israel his sin.
Great, thank you. So what do you notice that's similar to some of these other prophets? What similar charges does Micah bring? I guess I'll say.
Lack of justice?
Justice, yeah.
Not caring for people?
Yeah. Kind of a connected. Twice we see the word justice, and we're going to talk about that a lot more later on, so hold that thought. Verses 2 to 3, do you think this was happening literally? Tearing up, was this happening? Why would
Sounds
he
like
use
they're
that
being attacked by
language?
cannibals.
What's that?
Sounds like they're being attacked by cannibals.
Yeah. Why would he use that description?
Sacrifices?
There's a little bit of a connection to, I think it's in Amos, where it talks about the priests are eating the sins of the people. And there might be a connection to something like that. And yet, this is very much directed, and again, it's at the leaders. Verse 1, hear you heads of Jacob. And there's this, grotesque language of what they're doing to their subjects. And it's described as, like Eric said, this kind of cannibalistic practice. And I think the idea, and when we read the whole book of Micah, you'll see this theme of the leaders are oppressing people below them for their own personal gain. Food would just be one obvious need that people have. But there's all kinds of needs as well. Money is going to come up quite a bit. So yeah, it's not particularly clear what exactly is going on here, but there's also a sense that there's violence. They're going to talk about the whole city of Jerusalem, and God's going to describe them as a kind of violent people. Any other thoughts?
It's always that God is holding the leaders accountable. The people are responsible as well for their sin, but ultimately God is going to chastise the leaders and say, you are the ones who are leading the people into this. And you're like, the sin it starts with you. It's not that people aren't responsible. But God always is doing that. Like you see that in the book of Jude. Like, this is because of the leaders. You need to make sure your leadership is doing what God has called them to do.
It is like in John where the hired hand cares nothing for the sheep.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be caring for the sheep, but they're not.
Yeah.
Or I think also in Amos where it says, you feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness, if that's what the priests were doing.
Yeah.
They were profiting and benefiting from being very lax about the standards that they held people to.
And this is all going to lead up, I would argue, to the contrast we're going to see in chapter 5 when we hear about a ruler coming who's going to shepherd. And I think there's a contrast that's being built between these leaders and this future leader to come. What about
I think in verse 5,
Yeah.
you see that too, where it says, who make my people straight, who chant peace while they chew with their teeth. It's sort of like chew with your teeth, it's sort of like using the people up.
Mm-hmm.
Putting on a good show, sort of like with Jesus with the Pharisees and stuff.
Yeah.
I think too that simile of, like Eric mentioned, cannibalism almost in the beginning, I think is it's kind of going to jar into focus this idea that you might feel like by taking people's money, by taxing unfairly or whatever they're doing to skirt justice, if you're not physically hurting people, you might feel like, oh, it's not that bad. But Mike is like, no, this is just as bad as skinning people and eating their flesh.
Yeah. By the way, we're in Micah 3, verse 5-ish. Or, well, really 1 to 8, but we're on like verse 5. I agree. And I think I can almost imagine the the excuse from the leaders would be, but we haven't done these things. And God is going to say, yes, you have. You know, Jesus is, if you've thought an evil thought of your brother, you've murdered them. And I think that's probably what's in view here. Not to say that there wasn't all kinds of acts of injustice. There were all kinds of ways that you could cheat people who were poorer than you in the ancient world. If they didn't pay you back, you could just claim their field. There were all kinds of things that were probably going on where the rich or the leaders, I think it might be kind of the same group a little bit, oppressing the poor. What about the prophets, though? Prophets were in charge of teaching the word. And there's another sense you're going to see repeated where you see the prophets giving their people the kind of easy message. And sometimes they're actually doing it for money. And what makes more money, the easy message or the hard message that no one wants to hear? I think it's implied that the prophets are giving the easy message that people are excited to hear. What else? Anything else in this section?
Can't remember which kings, but there was the king of Judah that time visiting the king of Israel, and he brought out 400 of his prophets, and they all preached one thing.
Oh yeah.
And they still went against they went with that good sound, oh, we're going to win this victory and things. And at the time, then God punished them. Like there was actual cannibalism where cities were shut up so badly because the enemy were attacked, and they started eating your own children.
Yeah. One other thing I was just thinking too at the end of verse 5 where it says, declare war against him who puts nothing in their mouths. It's a vivid picture of these priests going around, declaring war on people, going around like asking for food, which is kind of an odd picture. Or maybe they were just getting money in certain ways. Oh, it's the new temple tax. Yes, you have to pay that. They were squeezing every last drop out of the poor.
I do love it in verse 8 that he gives a very concise description of what a prophet's job is.
Mm-hmm.
And you could apply this to all the rest of the prophets.
Mm-hmm.
They've been filled with the power of the Spirit, and they are declaring the truth to Israel, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the type, like, it doesn't have to be that they're telling the future, it doesn't have to be all this stuff, it's just the prophet's job is to tell the truth and what God has told them to say.
Yeah, I would think that any prophet at this time who was not speaking, like it said, to declare Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin, in verse 8, is probably a false prophet if you're not addressing any of those issues. What's your real motivation? And prophets weren't supposed to make money. That's another thing I always forget about it. I can't remember where in the law, but it specifically says prophets shouldn't make money, which makes you think, boy, that really should have been an easy law to follow. We see in verse 4, and I think in verse 4 is a description of the leaders and by the prophets as well. They're going to cry out, and God will not answer. He will hide his face. What's significant about God hiding his face? You see that picture quite a bit.
I mean, that's the opposite of the blessing in Numbers, right? The Lord bless you if you make his face shine upon you. And if he's hiding his face, you're not going to get to experience his glory or his goodness.
There was a pastor I was listening to on a sermon on this section, and he said when he does premarital counseling, it's always good when you get a husband and wife together and they're saying things, they become really good, like they're in the court and they're laying out. Very often, unfortunately, in the worst situations is where one comes and the other doesn't even come. And this pastor said those are the worst because this person can't even have the dignity to show up. They won't even be there. There's one thing to be there and say, you did this, but okay, now we're talking. Now we're having a conversation about this. God is, I'm going to just turn my face. I'm not even going to acknowledge you, which is which maybe turning your face, maybe that doesn't sound to us, but in biblical language, that's an awful, awful, awful kind of curse to have the face of God turned away. Any other comments on this section? We'll look at 9 to 12.
I was just thinking, you were talking about the prophesying in exchange for money, which they weren't supposed to do, but I think this could be another example of them becoming like the nations around them.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Old Testament, to this point, we've seen, the Pharaoh had magicians working for him, telling what to do. And you even see Balaam being called by the king of Moab to come and prophesy and curse these people. And so like it wouldn't have been a foreign concept for, if you're declaring these things for a king, you should be paid handsomely. And it's just another way where they're like, well, why should we not be like the people around us?
It's also worth noting too that, wait, no, never mind, I'm getting prophets and priests confused. But I will just throw it out there. One of the things that the Northern Kingdom was doing was they were setting up priests that were not Levites. That was another theme that we often see. But that's not mentioned in this, so that's a freebie. Verses 9 to 12. Hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and the rulers of the house of Israel, who detest justice. Make crooked all that is straight, who build Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. Its heads give judgment for a bribe, priests teach for a price. Its prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord in the midst of us? No disaster will come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain, the house of a wooded height. So we see three kinds of leaders gaining money in verses 11. Its heads give judgment for a bribe. I think the idea there is an actual judge ruling in a particular way for the highest bidder. Do we have, well, maybe not that, but do we have, you can bring in a fancy lawyer today who will smooth things out for you. Some of these things haven't gone away. Priests teach for a price. I'm not saying pastors shouldn't make money, but don't we have, we've pastors today who fly around in jets, and they talk about, they talk about this money that they have, that if you will support this ministry, you too can partake in this. And prophets practice divination for money. So they're not just making money, which they weren't supposed to, but they're doing it in a way that they shouldn't. They're doing divination, which is doubly awful. And what else do you notice about the message that they're bringing in verse 11?
Dangerous it is to be like deceiving yourself that you're doing something for God and attaching yourself to God.
Yeah.
Doing quite the opposite. But they don't see that.
It's kind of funny that a prophet is saying her prophets tell fortunes for money. Basically, Micah is saying, again, he's a prophet, and he's saying the prophets are doing this for...
Yeah. He's calling out the other prophets.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not him.
I think the difference though is that in the one case, it may have been like the king going, hey, what should I have for breakfast tomorrow type thing,
Yeah.
versus Micah coming with the word of God to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we don't do the same thing, but there's all kinds of distractions, I think, that can be sort of cloaked as a kind of Christian wisdom, where we really need the Lord, but we like to know all these other things, that start to crowd, which maybe I won't even get into. But I think, and again, I don't think that these kings thought that they were worshiping other gods. I think that they would have believed that these priests were that they were, I'll just say, it's the syncretism like I've been talking about. They started to slowly by generation mix with the Baal worship and other Canaanite religions, and to the point where this was their religion, and I don't think they thought anything was wrong with it, but it was very clear in the Word. Kings were supposed to know the Word, that it was in violation of much of its commandments.
I also think too that the prophets and the priests are preaching safety and security, and basically saying to the kings, you have safety and security because God is with us. If he was against us, we would have disasters. And Mike is saying here, get ready.
Yeah.
Coming. In verse 12. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. I mean, that's turning everything over, basically.
Yeah, he condemns the priests for basically preaching the easy thing. Oh, nothing bad's going to happen to us. They might have thought because of we have this special relationship with God. We're God's people. He could never. And then Micah turns around and he does exactly what they should have been doing, and he tells them what's going to happen. Now this is really interesting. If you note verse 12, this is where I said Micah's message we actually see in Jeremiah was actually accepted. So if you want to flip over to Jeremiah 26:16, this is very interesting. Jeremiah is preaching to the same, well, not the same living people, but to Jerusalem, the leaders of Jerusalem. And it's very interesting. In verse 16, they're about to put him to death, and they actually, some of the people remember Micah. So if you want to turn over there to Jeremiah 26:16, I'll just read. And then the officials and people said to the priests and prophets, this man does not, they're talking about Jeremiah, by the way, this man does not deserve the sentence of death, for he has spoken to us in the name of the Lord our God. And certain of the elders of the land arose and spoke to all the assembled people, saying, Micah of Moresheth prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and said to all the people of Judah, thus says the Lord of hosts, we already read it, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins. And so they actually remembered this prophecy, which I guess people believe. Now, what do we know about Hezekiah? Was he a good king? He was a pretty good king. But compared to the other kings, yeah, definitely a pretty good king. He is commended in the Book of Kings for his faithfulness, although there were other things that Micah was able to correct, and so apparently this prophecy was heeded by Jerusalem. Any other comments on this section? And again, another emphasis we see in verse 10, who builds Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. There's a little bit of a theme there's hints of violence we start to see. God refers to Jerusalem as a kind of warlike people in a kind of negative sense, and so that's one theme we start to see. Verse 1 of chapter 4. I'll read the first two verses. It shall come to pass in the later days. Back up. We suddenly get whiplash, all right? We hear about Jerusalem's going to be plowed like a field. The temple's going to be in ruins. And now suddenly we get this new picture. So I just want to make that emphasis before you're like, wait, what in the world's happening? It shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So what do you see as now a contrast to the Micah's current time?
The horrible prophets and injustice that they're seeing in that day compared to what will be.
Yeah.
The city of Jerusalem is in rubble, and
Yeah.
God's temple is established on the mountain.
Yeah. And what's significant about mountains in the Bible? What usually happens on mountains? Where God meets his people. There's also a sense in which it's also sort of where God sort of rules from, but where God is. And so this is giving a picture of God's presence. Now, temple was literally built on a mountain, so I think it's obviously referring to that. And in verse 1, I think that's it's referring to the temple. It shall come to pass in later days that the mountain of the house of the Lord. What was the house of the Lord? It was the temple. So this is a reference to just verse 12 is saying that all is going to be ruins, and now it's saying it's going to be lifted up. So there's going to be a kind of future restoration. And rather than foreign nations coming to invade Jerusalem, you're going to see foreign nations are going to be coming because they're going to hear the word of the Lord being proclaimed. And not only are they going to hear the word of the Lord, but I think it's in contrast to this kind of easy message and divination that was going on. Now you're going to hear the real, true word of the Lord. When does this happen? In the latter days. What are the latter days? So we hear this theme again and again of latter days, and it's not always particularly clear, as we may wish it was clearer. Although I think that some of these things are starting to kind of, I would argue, happen in stages. And there's a sense in which the latter days were in the New Testament time. John says we're in the last hour. And so there's a sense, but it depends on the context a little bit. So it's a little tricky. But it's definitely future. And some of these things we're going to hear later on, where people aren't going to learn war anymore, and Jesus is going to decide disputes between, he's going to judge the nations. These are things that have yet to come for us. And there's a renewal of, I'm kind of summarizing because I need to keep moving, but if you keep going in chapter 3, verses 4 to 5, we see this picture of people sitting under a tree. There's an idea that the land is going to be fertile, it's going to be prosperous. And I'll just read verse 5. For all the peoples walk in each the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. And then there's more renewal descriptions from 6 to the end of the chapter. Any other thoughts before I move on?
Nick, I have a footnote here in my Bible that really, for modern day application, back for chapter 3, verse 11. You know, we live in a time where so many of the leaders of the churches today are influenced by our society. And they're concerned about money being brought in to support the church to keep it open. There's concern as far as calling people out or speak on what is right because of losing members. And so my footnote, and just, you know, some things I think are not, it's just for the church in general, but it says, Micah warned the leaders, priests, and prophets of his day to avoid bribes. Pastors today accept bribes when they allow those who contribute much to control the church. When fear of losing money or members influence pastors to remain silent when they should speak up for what is right, churches are in danger. And I think so many of churches today fall victim and prey to that. They're afraid to speak the truth. They're afraid to speak on what God's word calls out because they're afraid of losing, not having the monies that come in, to not have the membership there. And so they stay silent. And, you know, very much our churches are very much like the leaders that we see here back in Micah's time, when they, you know, fall to those types of things.
Yeah, and I think something else that I see a lot today that is, I think as Americans, we love the idea of success. And I think it kills me when I see some of these stories about these leaders and these big Christian organizations and how open the leaders are about their extravagant lifestyle. And I mean, there's a church I heard about, and I heard, I won't say the salary, but it was maybe more than anyone in this, I don't know. It was a pretty high salary of a church about this size. And I mean, the congregation kind of liked it. They kind of thought it was good that we have this charismatic leader and he makes this big salary. And very often I think it's also the people not holding leaders accountable and saying, hey, this is what this says. Not that there's a perfect salary that every pastor should make and it's super clear, but when you read about what some of these leaders make and that their people just follow them and I don't know. You know, people have itching ears and they want to hear what they want to hear. You know, it's like, you know, I get really excited that Philly's made a bunch of deals, like, yeah, they're paying that guy, but it's like the same thing. It's like they're paying this guy an insane boatload amount of money. You know, but one is a shepherd and one is sports figure, you know. Anyway, I need to move on. Chapter 5. Again, we get this like whiplash. Chapter 5 should probably start verse 13, so I'm actually going to start in verse 13. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat in pieces many peoples, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, and their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. Now muster you troops, O daughters of troops, siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. So just,
Did
yeah.
you read 13, it's not lining up.
13 of 4, and then moving into 1 of 5.
Oh, you meant start at.
Oh,
4.
sorry, I started at chapter 4, verse 13, and then now I'm going in, and I went into 5. Some Bibles might have a note that the break makes a lot more sense between, if you were going to redo the chapters, you should probably start chapter 5 after verse 12, because it's kind of the same thought. Not that it's a big deal, but it flows a little bit better. But I wanted to just pause there with verses 13 and verse 1 to see, this is the background before we launch into verse 2. This idea of Zion preparing for battle. They're this war people, and they're about to be invaded. And note that they're about to be struck on the cheek. What is being struck on the cheek? Is that humiliation? What does that symbolize? It symbolizes humiliation. Everybody's smiling. I don't know why. Did something happen this week? I have no. It is interesting too that the word rod and judge, those words sort of rhyme a little bit in Hebrew. So sometimes when you wonder why a certain word is used, sometimes we say, "What's a rod? What is a rod?" What is it? Sometimes it's just the words kind of rhyme a little bit. So if a certain individual had brought a rock on a stage, you ever had thrown it at the person? So a rod is going to strike, well, I guess the word is a heter. A sabat is going to strike a sebet. So it's kind of a little bit of a word play there. But they're going to be humiliated is sort of the idea here. I had to have fun with that. And going into verse 2, but you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth, and then the rest of the brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, and in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. They shall dwell secure, for he will be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. When the Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces, he will raise them up against 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. So now again, we get whiplash. We get people are at the gate. Jerusalem is about to be humiliated, and then we get this right slam in the middle of that section. We get this promise of this leader to come. Obviously the Messiah, obviously Jesus. What descriptions are used of this ruler in this section? I mean, think about hearing this. You know nothing about the New Testament. You know nothing of Christ, and this is what you have to go on. What are you thinking about this leader? What descriptions are you getting?
Prince of Peace.
Prince of Peace. He shall be their peace.
He's a leader, because he would lead his flock with the Lord's strength.
So he's like a shepherd, which wasn't exactly a, you might say, oh, this person's going to be this great warrior, but a shepherd. A shepherd is like, I don't want to name a profession and insult somebody in this room, but a shepherd was, and maybe we don't have any shepherds, so I'll just talk about shepherds. Shepherds were not exactly, well, how would you describe shepherds in those days? How were shepherds viewed by society?
Lower class.
Down.
What's that?
Like lower class.
They were, yeah, that's a good description. So to hear that this ruler is going to be like a shepherd is an interesting description.
I do think it's really funny because Micah was a shepherd, so it'd kind of be like if you were to write a prophecy and be like, he also will be a pharmaceutical data steward. People were just like, are you just saying that because you're a shepherd? Are you just trying to make yourself sound good?
I think Amos was a shepherd.
Oh, Micah was
Yeah.
a shepherd.
Mark, I don't.
Amos was a shepherd, yes.
But
you're asking-
Micah, do we get-
You're asking about Micah?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know if it's,
Okay.
sorry. It is, I do think that there's something to say about that, though, that Micah is coming as a kind of that Amos came as a shepherd, especially since he's calling out the rich and the wealthy, as we comment. It's interesting that God would choose somebody of that lower class to come and bring this judgment against this higher class.
But they also say it's from old.
Ooh, yeah.
The one ruler in Israel who's going forth, or from old, from everlasting.
Yeah.
So that's important. I think the everlasting part, an everlasting ruler.
Yeah, a good literal translation would be he's from days of eternity. And this is an interesting topic, at least I find it very interesting, is that there was a lot of debates over what this Messiah would be. Would this Messiah be like a man like Moses with power from the Spirit of God? Or would there be sort of divine? And a lot of the rabbinic teaching said this Messiah is going to be sort of divine. And it's very interesting because there were a lot of teachings. You always wonder, like, what did the rabbis do with some of those passages, like the man that wrestles with Jacob, the angel of the Lord, the one individual that appears to Abraham, almost like saying, "I am God," or even the times you see the angel of the Lord in Exodus. There were teachings. There's evidence of this that the rabbis had this idea that you can't see God and live. But it seems as though in the Old Testament there was a version of God you could see, a version that you could touch and not be incinerated. There's hints of that in the writings. And what they had said was that there seems to be that this Messiah might be like that.
This actually comes into play in Matthew 22, because the Pharisees at the time understood that the Messiah was to come from the line of David, from specifically the city of Bethlehem, from this verse right here. And in Matthew 22, toward the end of it, Christ questions the Pharisees, "Who do you say I am?" Sort of similar question that he gave to his disciples, and they said, "The Son of David." But I don't think he had just recently come from Jerusalem, or not from Jerusalem, from Nazareth, and they thought him to be, not from Bethlehem. I think they were confused, had lost track that he really was born in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And they properly said he was the son of David, but not realizing it.
And this is why there were debates. I mean, they said he's going to be of the lineage of David. Okay, that means he's going to be a man. Okay, but then how is he from ancient? One side would have said, well, he's ancient in that. Well, who else was born in Bethlehem? David, seeing he's coming from ancient old roots might have been one way, but I think the language just seems a little bit too clear that there's something else going on here. There's something sort of supernatural. Jesus was born in an ordinary way, but there's something too about his lineage that is ancient. It's more ancient than Mary, right? In the beginning was the Word, and he's from days of eternity. You read too, if you look at Isaiah 9, you don't have to turn there, I'll just read it. "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given." Okay, that sounds like pretty normal stuff. "And the government shall be on his shoulders, and his name shall be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God." Wait, this man is going to be called God. That's where, again, there was a lot of debates over what this means. "Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." We get that word again. Anything else? If you're wondering in verse 3, is this a reference to Mary? Which would be kind of cool. "Therefore she'll give in time when she's labor or given birth." Most commentators say that's probably not a reference to Mary. If you look at the context, go back to verse 13 of chapter 4. "Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion." Or, no, excuse me, earlier on, verse 9. Verse 9 of chapter 4. "Has your counselor perished? The pain seized you like a woman in labor." There seems to be a picture in this section of a woman being in labor and connecting that to this idea of Jerusalem being taken away into exile. So when you see, going back to chapter 5, sorry for the back and forth, chapter 5, verse 3, "When she who is in labor is given birth, the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel." So there's actually an idea that Jesus, the Messiah, is going to shepherd his people away into exile, and he's actually going to be with them when they return. And notice that it says his brothers. So again, you get this like, wait, he's God, but it's his people, it's his brothers. You get both. There's a theme here as well that I'll introduce, and then we have one more section to look at. That when does the exile end? Is an interesting question to study. It almost sounds as though the exile, and you can see evidence of this, that the exile wasn't entirely complete until Jesus came. There were comments of we're back in the land, but we're not quite back. God hasn't entirely restored us. And so there's actually a sense in these prophets where you see Jesus as sort of the one who's going to bring an end to the exile. Well, I want to look at verse 6. I always start with, I get my verses and chapters mixed up a lot. I'm sorry. I don't know why I do that. Chapter 6, verse 6. Very famous section that we have to talk about. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, 10,000 of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, and the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Very famous section of Scripture. Before we get to the last bit, though, what's going on in the first few verses there with all these over-the-top sacrifices and offerings?
Seems as though the people are trying to work themselves to God, not realizing that that's not possible.
Yeah.
And God is looking for a change in heart that truly only He can provide. So it's their lack of humility that is their biggest downfall.
It sounds more rhetorical as far as, should I do this? But no, God just wants our heart and soul, our honesty, our integrity. He doesn't want burnt offerings if it's not going to be with a proper heart.
It ties in with what we talked about in Amos 5, right? I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies, even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings. I will not accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs, the melody of your harps I won't listen to, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So this idea of you can do all these rituals, but if your heart's not in the right place, it's noxious. It's not a pleasing aroma to the Lord.
One description that I think makes a lot of sense is this is a little bit like in It's a Wonderful Life. Like, what do you want, the moon? Like it's like a person that almost doesn't even know, like knows God's disappointed. It's like, what do you want? You want my firstborn? It's very intense. And God is like, you know what's good. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly, which is in many ways harder than all these other things. When you know when you know that you've really done justice and love kindness, and I wanted to talk so much more about justice, and I think, or what justice means in the Bible, and I think that might be a good last week topic, because every time I get to it, I want to really dive in. I just don't have enough time, because there's lots of talk about justice today, right? And I wouldn't say that everything in the secular society in the topic of justice is wrong, but there's some things that are a little bit different. Again, there's some half-truths going on, and I think when we read about justice in the Bible, it's a really big topic. When we say doing justice,
people don't want to hear about the justice of God.
There's that, yeah.
I think there's a lot of Christians that don't even want to talk about God's justice.
Yeah.
But He's a just God. He says He's going to do this. He does it. He doesn't hedge.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and one of the things that I found when studying this is that sometimes when you talk about the justice of God, I think it frustrates both sides. It frustrates conservatives and it frustrates progressives, because sometimes there's this stuff about helping the poor that people say, yes, that's justice, that's doing justice. And then the other side might say justice is about punishing wrongdoers. But it's going to say both very strongly. And so I think I'm going to have to just pass over it for now, unfortunately. Because it's a big topic and I want to do it justice.
Very good.
But any other closing thoughts?
So quick question, sorry, because this is bothering me. So who is the woman in that passage? Who's it referring to, the woman giving birth? Did you say?
I think it's a symbol for Israel, and the kind of like, I think it's describing probably the exile in this time, like childbearing is this difficult. I think that's the most complicated. Some people say it might be Mary, I don't know.
That's just who I thought it was referring to, but.
I actually thought that too, and a lot of the commentators just said, yeah, it'd be really cool, but it just doesn't seem to, it just seems like there's too many references to Israel in labor. But then again, it's like both things could kind of be true at the same time. Israel is being saved through a woman in labor, while also the trial is being, so it can be something like that. Yeah.
In here it says, to act justly. Is to act justly the same as carrying out justice?
I guess you could say the difference is I don't have the authority to carry out justice in the way that a real judge could, but I can act justly in the things that I have. I guess that might be what I would say. That's just my.
How you treat people, but then,
Yes.
you know, I think, do we mix up those two words? Because we should not be actually carrying out justice, that's for God to do.
Yes.
So, when we're talking about justice, I think it's important that we are careful, that we clarify the difference between those two things.
Well, I think, and it's not that, I would say it's not that it doesn't include carrying out justice, because you could say a society that lets criminals free is not a just society, even though I'm not the one necessarily carrying it out. Again, this is where the topic of justice is really big. To maybe just give a really quick summary, there's a sense in which, on the one hand, it does involve penalties for crimes. Another word just might be fairness. Now, the word equity is really big today, but I think in its truest sense, I think it's not a bad word. And I think maybe we bristle at that a little bit because there's lots of talks about that. But stop and think maybe just on the micro level of human person-to-person interaction. Do I treat people differently because of their race, because of their gender, because of their economic status? We would say no. Now, what makes government policy? That might, I mean, I think that's kind of that could be a different thing. But treating people fairly, I think, and giving them what is owed, I think would be, it's a very big topic to introduce. But I think, I agree with what you're saying, though, that carrying out justice, legal justice, is obviously not up to me officially. Now, we vote for leaders who appoint justices, but.
I just think that whole thing, like you said, is the act of being fair and kind.
Yes.
How we, carry out our treatment to others.
Yeah.
But that's the acting justly. When we talk about justice, there's a big difference, I think, between the two. And just something for when we're talking about that.
Well, and doing justice, and there's also a side of it. See, this is why I need more time. This is where it also means looking out for particular groups that are vulnerable. Comes up in Scripture. And the four groups that come up the most are widows, orphans, poor, and the refugees or the immigrants. Those are the groups that get called out a lot as you were not caring for those people and you weren't being just. And that's where, again, it does kind of overlap into the kindness aspect. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is a really good picture of doing justice. Now, it's not that, now you might say that, because that group hearing that would have said, well, they're Samaritans, they're bad, they don't deserve our love. And Jesus is, I think, is suggesting that this is what it means to. Now, in that sense, that's the part of the mercy. But I think they go together. We'll have to talk about it. Sorry. It's a big topic. All right. We're going to do Jonah next week, so everyone's favorite. So, thank you.
All That was discussion, I did the chapters like that, starting like, so we can, anytime we're, we get it.
There are.